Hello and welcome to The Future of Business, the podcast where each week we discuss current business issues that will have a significant impact on the future of business in Ireland and beyond, and explore their possible consequences for people in business and for people in society more generally. I'm Vincent Wall, and today I'm joined by Bernard Barron, partner of Mazars in Ireland, and Jerry Moriarty, Chief Executive of Irish Association of Pension Funds. Bernard, if I could come to you first. Lay out for us initially just the level of cover that people have for income, for pensions in retirement.
Yes, Vincent. I suppose in Ireland we have a particular issue in relation to private sector pension coverage. Only 1/3 of private sector employees are covered in occupational pension schemes currently, and that does raise quite a few concerns. It means that people are deferring for their retirement in terms of what type of income that they will have at that stage. So if they don't plan well ahead, as apparently a number of them aren't, that will affect what they have in the longer term in terms of their retirement income.
It effectively means that a huge proportion of the population of the workforce are totally dependent for their retirement income on the state pension.
Absolutely. They're dependent on that, or else they are, for example, business people may, as employers, be thinking the business will generate enough of income or enough of wealth in the future to supplement them on top of the state pension. But that's a very risky type of approach to take. It's hoping for the best as opposed to planning for the future in terms of what the income that you will actually have on your retirement.
And how do we compare with other comparable countries, for instance, in terms of the level of private pension cover that we have?
Yeah, we're much lower, and some of the reasons are, for example, in other countries they might have a compulsory system where you have to become a member of a pension scheme, or an automatic enrolment where you might have an opt-in or an opt-out type of system. So that definitely, like the UK, for example, they introduced the auto-enrollment maybe about 10 years ago, and that has resulted in a much, much higher level of participation of employees now.
And we'll come and discuss, obviously, how that might work here or a similar model here. But Jerry, the current situation can't continue where people, or a lot of people, are dependent just on the state's pension because, one, the dependency ratio, the number of people paying taxes who can support the state pension is dropping. And two, people have a huge expectation now of their retirement income, don't they?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think a lot of people tend to look at, parents or grandparents and see that they can live a very active life. And they don't realise that a lot of that is because a lot of those people would have been in the old traditional defined benefit pension schemes where you've got quite a healthy income in retirement. But that has to be planned for and, has to be paid for in some way. You have to save in advance. You feel, look, we have a relatively young population compared to a lot of other European countries. We're quite young in terms of the makeup of the population. At the moment, we have about 5 people of working age for every one pensioner. But if you look at demographic projections over the next 50 years or so, that goes to 2 people of working age for every one pensioner. And when you consider that all our state pensions and all our public sector pensions are paid out of current government income, there's no fund there for those.
So you have to question its sustainability.
Exactly, because obviously you're now relying on 2 taxpayers to fund all of that, where you've got 5 at the moment. And that's going to put a lot of pressure on our state pension. When the €5 increase comes into effect in March next year, it's about €13,000 a year.
And that's if you have the maximum.
If you've the maximum entitlement, and they're also talking about changing that you now have to work for full 40 years to get the maximum entitlement. It's designed to keep people out of poverty. It's not designed necessarily to give you a great retirement. And I think you're right about expectations. People do have greater expectations, and people are living longer, and they're going to be a lot fitter in retirement. And there's also another issue on the horizon, which is, most people today who come to retire, if you've had a mortgage, you've paid it off. But if you got a lot of people who are going to be renting their whole lives, you have to continue to pay your rent in retirement as well. So you've got a double whammy for a lot of those people.
Before we get too gloomy about this, Bernard, obviously we need to change. There has been a lot of talk for a long time at government level and in the industry about what needs to change. But there is a roadmap now, as it's called, out there for change within 4 years. And it is, broadly speaking, about auto-enrollment. Explain, broadly speaking, what they're proposing.
Yeah, the auto enrolment is one of maybe about 6 key points that are in that roadmap for pension reform, which it really extends out to 2023. And the auto enrolment part of it is quite a challenging one for employers particularly. So what's involved there is whereby employees will have to automatically be enrolled in a pension scheme. So the employer will have to, it's compulsory. But the employee then will have an option, in other words, to opt out of the scheme after something like 6 to 9 months. It's not clear exactly what that is yet. But that means that the employer will have to pick up the tab in terms of the amount of employer contribution for those employees, as well as the employees themselves contributing, and then the government, as part of its contribution, will give approximately 1/3 of the amount that the employee contributes. So that could go up to 6% over a 5-year period, from 1% up to 6% over a 5-year period.
At the moment, it's mooted that the employer and the employee over time would each contribute about 6%, and the government perhaps
2%, exactly. Yeah, 6% from the employer, 6% from the employee, and 2% from the government, which would give you a total of 14%, which is a better average in terms of the amount of contribution towards a pension scheme.
Jerry, from the association, from the industry's point of view, do you broadly welcome this approach?
Yeah, we broadly welcome it. I mean, as an association, we're actually representing largely employers who already have pension plans in place, so it shouldn't be a huge impact on them. But because of the reasons we spoke about, the demographic changes, the need to have more people saving more for retirement, this is proven in other countries where auto-enrollment's been introduced to be a very effective way of doing that. It's introduced in the UK, like Bernard said. There are now 11 million people saving for retirement in the UK that weren't 6 years ago. Their contribution levels they're being phased in, so they're quite low. But any studies that have been done among those people, the general view is that I knew I needed to do something about organising pensions, start saving, and I'm really glad somebody did it for me. The opt-out rates are only about 10%, so 90% of people who've been opted in have stayed in, which is obviously quite promising. They use a lot of kind of behavioural nudging. Most people don't make a decision as to where they're going to invest in, so they end up in a default fund that's been set up for them. And it's been very successful. If you look at other countries, Australia's actually got a mandatory system. They're running at about a 9% contribution level in total. At the UK, when they get up to the full contribution levels next year, it'll be 8%. So our 14 is quite aggressive relative to that, but it is designed to give people an adequate income in retirement.
And I was just going to ask you that. I mean, that target of 14 from the employee, the employer, and the state, is that seen as sufficient? Because there are worries about the investment returns on pensions at the moment in an era of low interest rates. Is 14% the target on the basis that people get in relatively early and they maybe have 30, 40 years of contributions?
Yeah, that's about the right level. And when you combine it with the state level, with the state pension, I think the projections they're showing is that the majority of people will have about 60% of their pre-retirement income in retirement. In retirement, expenses tend to be lower. You don't have the expense of travelling to work and things like that. So 60% is deemed to be a sort of reasonable level that would allow most people to pretty much continue your similar standard living than you had pre-retirement.
Bernard, for employers, as you mentioned, at least for the first 6 or 9 months while the employee is making up his or her mind as to whether to stay in this, and international precedent shows that most will, at the moment employers only have to inform their employees about pension options. They don't have to contribute to that. That's obviously going to change, at least temporarily, perhaps permanently, in 4 or 5 years' time. What sort of issues are out there for employers to gear themselves up about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the key point is exactly that. It's a cost. It's an additional cost for the employer. Now, you can say that that's something that the employers are considering at the moment and deciding that they may be given benefits in other ways. Obviously, there are 1/3 of the pension or the employees already in the schemes. So those employers are taking a view that that benefit is part of the package. Employers may be giving other parts of a package at the moment, and if it goes to part of the package being a pension payment, then maybe some other parts of that package may suffer. Alternatively, though, it could just be an additional cost which they need to think about in terms of profitability and sustainability of their own business and whether they'll be able to incur that cost. Obviously, with the business environment the way it is at the moment, a perk like a pension is a good benefit for an employee to keep them, to retain them. And that's something that's probably part of the thinking in terms of should an employer offer that or not at the moment. But in the future, they won't have a choice. If the employee stays in, auto-enrolls and stays in, then they will have to pay the contribution towards that employee's
And that
pension.
could be a particular challenge for SMEs, I suppose. 6% on top of their payroll costs, perhaps permanently. They need to start thinking about that. They need to start planning now, don't they?
Absolutely, and it's a 6% that you will incur regardless of how the business is doing, or it won't necessarily improve the top line or the turnover or the bottom line, certainly, in terms of it's an additional cost. So there will have to be planning done ahead, and I suppose that's one of the key points. Really, we probably have around 4 years or so to think ahead before this is coming in 2022, or due to come in at least, the employers need to think ahead in terms of how is the business going to be sustainable, going to be able to cope with that, and what changes need to be put in place. Obviously, there's an administration side to this whole part as well.
Well, I was just going to ask Jerry about that, actually. Are there going to be additional administrative burdens for employers, particularly those who don't have employees in pension schemes at the moment, Jerry? Or how's that going to be looked after?
Yeah, so what the government have done at the moment is they've published what they call a straw man, which is a model of how the system, how they see it working. And they've basically asked anybody who's interested to comment on that and come back with either better ways of doing it or pointing out flaws or whether they agree with it or not. So the model they're proposing in the straw man is really designed to try and keep the administration for employers as straightforward as possible. They're looking at, to a large extent, very small employers. I heard recently there are 111,000 employers in Ireland with fewer than 5 employees. So it's that level of, these are employers that don't have payroll departments, they don't have HR functions. So what they're proposing to do is that the government will set up what they call a central processing agency. The employer will have to enrol their employee, but that's pretty much all they do other than paying the contributions across. So the central processing agency will deal with the employees. The Central Processing Agency will run a tender process where there will be 4 providers who will be able to operate in this market. Because they're looking at about 410,000 people they're looking at people earning over 20,000 a year, over the age of 23, under the age of 60. So they reckon that's a potential population of 410,000 people to be auto-enrolled. They want scale because they believe there are cost efficiencies you get with scale. So they're looking about having 100,000 people in each scheme effectively. So the Central Processing Agency, the employee will choose which scheme they want to go into. Most employees don't feel comfortable making that type of choice, so they will automatically just allocate a scheme to them, and it will be done on a carousel basis, so the 4 providers get a sort of equal allocation. And then if the employee moves jobs, they can stay within that scheme. They don't have to go to new employer schemes. So really all the employer will have to do is enrol the employees and pay the contributions, and they don't have to do any of the usual admin you do in the pension scheme. So it is designed to make it as, from an administration point of view, as straightforward as possible for employers.
Although, is it clear yet who will pay the administrative costs of that proposed government agency?
Yeah, that's not clear. I mean, they talk about the 4 providers having a maximum charge that they can charge on member accounts of 0.5%, which is it could be a challenge because you've got investments, you've got administration that needs to go on. It's not clear whether the government is picking up the cost of that, whether it's going to come from the providers. So that's a bit vague in the paper at the moment.
And is it clear, Bernard, whether employers who currently have employees in pension schemes, or some of their employees, could perhaps transfer into this new arrangement if they thought it reduced their administrative burden, or if they thought that the pension offer available to employees was better?
No, it's not clear. There's a number of aspects that are not that clear, and obviously it is out to consultation currently. That's one of the aspects as to the transferability. The other aspect would be the tax relief side of things, as to whether there would be a sort of a parallel 2 systems whereby the tax relief as currently stands would be available for those who already have pension schemes outside of the auto-enrollment, and whether the people who are auto-enrolled then have the tax, the €2 versus the €6 that is already been put in by the employer and employee.
I presume it's pretty certain that if the state is going to contribute something like €2 into the new scheme for people not in pensions, they won't be getting tax relief as well. I presume that's pretty certain, is it?
Yeah, I think they've made that pretty clear that it is actually it has to be worked out in terms of how that is not in addition. It's an alternative means, but it will be out of the same pot, and I don't think there will be any additional funding coming, or I wouldn't expect that there will be additional funding coming from the government towards pension costs.
And that is one of the reasons why they're not clear about whether you can transfer into the system or not, because at one of the government are currently doing some public consultations on it, and at one of the consultations they implied that because you're not getting tax relief, so it's coming from your kind of your gross salary effectively, that you wouldn't be taxed on the benefits on the way out. Because, you're getting in the...
As you are now.
Yeah, as you are now. So the way the tax system works at the moment, it's a deferral of tax. You're not taxed on the money because you don't have the use of it, but once you have the use of it, your tax is income on the way out. So there was a suggestion you wouldn't be taxed in the other system. So you couldn't have somebody who's got tax relief on the way in and then transfer across and not pay tax on the way out. Now, while I was suggesting one of the consultations, that was kind of rolled back on pretty quickly, and I think the Department of Finance said no decisions have been made on that. I would have thought you have to tax on the way up because you are getting a government contribution. It's a different type of contribution, but you are getting the 2% from the government. So it's that bit about whether there will be two different tax systems running, that just makes things a little bit confusing, and that does impact on the ability to transfer in or out.
And the whole drive behind this government roadmap is to get more people paying into private pensions, more private pension cover for them in their retirement. But will it also enable greater consolidation of pension schemes generally, even for the likes of people like me, who is self-employed and I'm trustee of my own pension scheme?
Yeah, and that's something separately the regulator's been pushing that quite strongly in recent times anyway. They believe, they're very strong. We have far too many small schemes. People can't devote the time in terms of being a trustee. When you're in your own scheme and you're the trustee effectively, to some extent it doesn't really matter because you're looking after yourself. But what they're more worried about is where you're looking after other people's money, and that's what a lot of trustees are doing, and they don't necessarily have the sort of education to do that. They're relying very heavily on advisors. They may not have the ability to question them properly to understand what's really going on. So, separately, there's new European regulations coming into effect in January. That's going to require, certainly for larger schemes initially at least, all trustee boards have one trustee who's got a prescribed educational qualification and one trustee who's got a certain amount of experience as well. At the moment, those rules don't apply to schemes with fewer than 100 members, but certainly the regulator has indicated they're going to recommend to the department that sort of exemption isn't applied, that it should apply to all schemes. And they see that as a way of really forcing the consolidation of those smaller schemes.
And while that probably will give greater assurance in terms of governance to members of schemes, it probably will bring an extra administrative burden to smaller schemes as well over time. Yeah, I mean, over time, there will be a burden in terms of, where do you go and how do you get there? But it will take away a lot of the governance requirements. So, there will be one set of trustees looking after a whole load of different schemes. So, the employer won't have to get involved. And it's almost back to the auto-enrollment where the employer really will just have to choose a provider and pay the money in, and they don't have the governance requirements that come with running pension schemes at the moment. Bernard, perhaps finally to you, the government has set out its roadmap. They're looking at perhaps 2022 for this new auto-enrollment scheme to kick into effect. But we have discussed some of the areas that haven't been clarified yet. There are a lot of stakeholders in this process. Can you see it happening then?
Well, I think it has been a long process. I was talking to Jerry about how long it has been. The discussions and so on have been going on. We now have a position where at least there is a roadmap, or there's something more definitive that's there, which is narrowing down significantly down where the options are and pointing more specifically, I suppose, the way things are likely to go. Now, there is a bit of teasing out and certainly some of the detail there that we discussed about earlier. That will take a bit of teasing out and, I suppose, discussion and consultation. But I think it's in a narrower band. And I think there is an urgency on this because obviously pensions you can defer and the discussions have been deferred, but there is an urgency insofar as the dependency ratio from a government point of view is not sustainable. Because there are going to be a lot less people working to just pay for the continuing benefits that are pension benefits that are going to be enjoyed. Either that will have to be tackled sooner rather than later, or else there will be a major problem. Like one of the things that struck me very forcibly was that within that report on the reform roadmap, it mentions that if it's not tackled, that there could be within 50 years 400 billion of a deficit. So that's huge, if it went that way. So there is an urgency on it to tackle it sooner rather than later, and 2022 sounds reasonable enough, I think.
Gentlemen, we'll leave it there. Bernard Barron of Mazars Ireland and Jerry Moriarty, Chief Executive of the IAPF, thanks indeed for joining us. The main points that I took from our conversation was that, as Bernard mentioned there at the end, the current situation is not sustainable, where 2/3 of private sector employees are not paying into a private pension. It's just not sustainable, either for the state or for their own expectations in retirement. There is a roadmap out there now. We need to move quickly on that to get people into an auto-enrollment scheme. Hopefully, like the overseas models, most people will stay in there, and it'll be a relatively painless way of saving for your retirement. And I suppose for employers, for businesses, particularly those who are not paying into a pension scheme for their employees at the moment, they need to start planning now, only 4 years out, and budgeting for the fact that they will be contributing at least 6% in addition to payroll now for those pension contributions. Until the next time, thank you and bye-bye. Thank you for listening to The Future of Business with Vincent Wall and Mazars. We welcome any feedback to our podcasts, and particularly your suggestions as to topics we should cover. You can comment and rate us wherever you find this podcast or on mazars.ie. Bye for now.